You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.
Welcome back to the On the Way Home podcast. I'm your host, Michael Braithwaite from Blue Door, my incredible organization that works in York, Durham, and Peel region, supporting our most vulnerable on their housing journey, their health journey, their employment journey, and much, much more. Check out the cool work of Blue Door at bluedoor.ca. Friends, on this podcast, we are in really interesting times right now. As I record this podcast, the election provincially in Ontario has just been called. Federally, our party, the Liberal Party right now, is looking for a new leader, new prime minister, and for most likely in March they'll call election. I'm not sure when the election will happen, but sometime in the spring. And with housing and homelessness top of mind for so many in an election issue, I mean, these are interesting times. Lots of kind of announcements happening, different things going on, and very challenging for our sector as we look forward. And one of the things that always helps us when we're trying to work with partners, get funding, address the problem is, what exactly is the problem? Where's the data? What is it? Why should I care? Why should I make this a priority? And so today, that's what we're going to talk about. We're actually joined today. Recently, there was Ontario Association of Municipalities of Ontario report, AMO report, along with HelpSeeker and others that came out and talked to us with staggering numbers. 80,000 people in 2024 experiencing homelessness. We talk in the podcast about it's a 22% increase from just 2022. And if we don't do anything in the next 10 years, that number could balloon to 300,000 people experiencing homelessness. So today we're joined by Jesse Donaldson. I've known Jesse a long time. She's done incredible work with the best of the best and is now Executive Vice President of Strategic Services, Customer Success with HelpSeeker. And we've had one of HelpSeeker's founders, Alina Turner, on before. Incredible work. Her and her partner Travis, who have done this work across Canada, doing great stuff. And also we are joined by Michael Jacek, who is the Senior Advisor at the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, AMO. And so the two of them, we walked through the report. How did it all come about? What were the surprises? What did they learn? They have some recommendations coming out. We talk about how homelessness is not, they say it's called the unequal effect of the crisis, meaning that it doesn't affect everyone equally. We see Indigenous populations and others that have less access to service and affordable housing, etc. And we talk about what happens if we do nothing, what needs to be done, what their hopes are for the future coming out of this, if we're having this conversation a few years down the road, and much, much more. So without further ado, let's go to that conversation now. Michael, Jesse, thank you so much for joining the podcast today. Great to have you here.
Good morning. The two Michaels.
Yeah, and a couple of years ago, right, that had a different meaning. Coming out of China, the two Michaels, really that became a thing. Not on this podcast, folks. It's all good. We always start the podcast with the same question for all guests, and because it's very personal to everyone. And that is, what does home mean to you? So, Michael, we'll start with you, and then we'll go to Jesse.
I think what home means to me is having a stable roof over my head, having a place to call home that I have some independence and autonomy over, and allows me to live, work, and play in the city that I live in, and that it affords good health and allows me to hold a job and raise my family.
Awesome. That's hard to beat, Michael. I think home has changed for me. I've been lucky to have a structural home my whole life. I think home wasn't always a safe, easy place to be as a child. And I think as an adult, home has turned much closer to something that Michael describes, where my people are, where I feel safe, where I feel secure. And I'm very privileged for that. But it's changed over time. And I don't know if I've really felt home until later in my adult life.
And I love what you're saying there, because home isn't a place. It really is that feeling that you're talking about, right? And that feeling is a little different for everyone and at different times. And let's talk about your journeys into this work. Both of you have been at this for a considerable amount of time. Maybe we'll start with you, Jesse. Can you walk us along your journey into the space you're working in now?
Well, longer than I'd like to admit, Michael. You were actually part of my journey. I was telling my partner last night, who's also named Michael, so now that there's 3 Michaels, which isn't good. In 2010, I went to London. I was there for a few years working in the homelessness space, and then I came back to Toronto. And one of the first jobs I met Stephen Gates, which I know he's been a guest, and Tim Richter, who is a fan of the podcast. And I think my first job was in York Region, United Way York Region, doing the youth homelessness research study. And what was cool was I got to actually interview, it was upwards of 60 youth experiencing homelessness. Myself, not much older, frankly, than some of them. And so grounding that in that sort of lived experience was, that was really, I think, an advantage and a privilege. And then throughout the years, I did the first State of Homelessness report with Stephen Gates again. So that was a great privilege. And then different positions, worked with Home Depot on their commitment to end youth homelessness. And then found myself at HelpSeeker through a windy road. But yeah, Michael, I remember being in the boardroom with you at that York Region office years and years ago. Actually, no, I think it was your office at the time. What was that organization?
That's what it was with Pathways, or
Yes.
now 360 Kids, right? So
Yes, exactly. So yeah, great to be back.
we did a little stint. We did the agenda together with Paul Klein and then one of our clients years ago, and that was pretty nerve wracking, right? It was good. I mean, Steve
Yes.
Bacon is so great, right? So
Have you watched that video recently?
no, I'm a little afraid to, but I remember you were excellent. You were natural. Just boom,
Thank you.
right? I can remember too that he's like, and what he said, it's just like a natural chair. Like he's so good. He's like, because our client, a person with lived experience, was freaking out. And he said, "Just talk to me. We're having a conversation." And she did, and she relaxed, and he got the best out of her. It was very, very cool. And yeah, at such a young age, you came into this work. You've had an impact. You've worked with some of the industry leaders, with Steve Gates, Paul Klein, Alina, and Travis now at HelpSeeker. So doing incredible work, been really giving us a lot of the data, and groups like Blue Door where I work. I mean, that's how we make a case. And what you're doing now, we're going to talk about today, we'll get to, but that data really, really matters. It's meaningful. Michael, how about yourself?
Yeah, so I've had a journey over the past 25 years or so, getting to this point where I'm at now, working on the homelessness file. Early on in my career, right out of school, I was a social assistance caseworker working with different vulnerable populations in the city. For a while, I managed a refugee resettlement program for the federal government, which basically brought people from overseas and resettled them and integrated them into the community, starting with shelter upon arrival. I've done some program administration work. I worked for the City of Toronto for a number of years, working with their shelter division, doing some oversight and program management of the working with community agencies in the city to help shelter people and appropriately respond. And then I ended up at the Association of Municipalities of Ontario, where basically my function is to develop policy, make recommendations to my board, and then engage in intergovernmental relations to promote those policies. And I'm the social policy advisor, and homelessness and housing is the largest part of my portfolio right now.
Very cool. And we often say on this podcast, Michael, that the housing crisis we're in started with bad policy, can only change through good. So glad you are doing that work. Today, we want to talk about it's a bombshell of a report. It came out a little while ago, and wow, I mean, did it get traction because the numbers behind it and all the different pieces is so well done. And that is it's the AMO report, Municipalities Under Pressure, the Growing Human and Financial Costs of Ontario's Homelessness Crisis. So we want to talk about that report. Let's start with, how did this report all come about, and what was the process taken to put it together, and who was all involved?
Maybe I'll start with that. So my association representing the municipalities of Ontario, homelessness and affordable housing has been top of mind for a number of years. Municipalities, we believe, are on the front lines of the crisis, along with community agencies that work with homeless individuals. So it was something that our association really wanted to do something about. And what we saw is that there wasn't really a good picture or good information about the state of homelessness in Ontario. So, we set out what we thought was going to be this ambitious research project to sort of figure out, the current and future state, where it's at, where homelessness could be going, what it would take to end chronic homelessness in communities across Ontario. We partnered with a couple of other municipal associations, the Ontario Municipal Social Services Association and the Northern Ontario Service Deliverers Association, to generate this study. And we found a great partner with HelpSeeker Technologies, which can fit the bill to be able to complete this for us. And they worked well with our municipalities and our district social service administration boards across the province to collect data and put this picture together and do some great analysis and some advice for the future. So that's sort of where we got onto this, and I think it's it just really comes down to our association just believes that the homelessness crisis is taking such a devastating toll on people and communities across the province, and there's a cost in inaction.
Very cool. Jesse, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I think Michael touched on it. I think if I remember the brief, there was 3 questions. One was the current state. The next was cost of doing nothing, or not cost, but the outcome of inaction. And then the third was how do we fill the gap? And honestly, that most of the time we took was on that first question. And that was to the credit of the service managers, municipalities, the DSABs, on kind of pulling together their data in a standardized way. And wasn't perfect, but we really appreciated how committed everyone was. So we actually had 100% participation from all service managers with a data ask that went back to 2016. And Michael, homelessness data barely exists in 2016. So the amount of data they were able to pull and the effort it required, it was really incredible. And we wouldn't have been able to do something as, I think, reliable as we all thought it was without it.
I'll tell you a quick funny data story. So when I started in 2010 at Pathways, 360 Kids, the big question, and everyone would always ask on youth homelessness, they're like, well, like how many, right? Like what are we talking about here? And no one had the data. So there was the 225,000 that's kind of been thrown around across Canada. So I did some math around, all right, if this is across Canada and York is this much of that in youth or this and the poverty, it came up with just this kind of wild number of between 300 and 500 kids. And I started saying approximately. That became fact so quick without any science behind it. And I'm like, shit, this is spiraling out of control. Where I remember like a couple of years later, the chairman of the region was dropping that number about 300. I'm like, wow, no, someone's going to fact check this. This is made up, but they just needed a number, right? So thankfully, you are not doing that. You're doing the real work with real numbers, but it is the data that and it's hard because people will say, well, I guess it doesn't exist if we don't have the data, so it's not really a problem. In this instance, you have said, here's all the data, but you've also, as you said, here's some solutions, right? Like here's some different things, and we want to get into that. So what did you find out in doing this, and what were the biggest surprises?
Just to go quickly to go back, Michael, on your number, you're totally right. Those numbers become lore, and a lot of them are napkin math, which is actually sometimes what we need to do. I have a great person on my team, Lori, and she actually went back to the Ontario numbers and she traced them. And most of the Ontario numbers were coming from a Shapcott quote, like 2010, like and then people repeat it becomes fact. And so I hope they continue to repeat this one, but I of course hope it goes down. But Michael, maybe you want to talk about those findings too.
Sure. Yeah. And, I just follow up on this. I think we had a really solid methodology to go about doing this. So we definitely stand by the numbers. And, despite what the number is, any number is too high. We all know that. So, anyways, our takeaways from the report and the findings and sort of, what surprised us, what didn't. We know that Ontario is at a tipping point in the homelessness crisis. I think this study confirmed a lot about what municipalities and communities on the ground know in their communities. But I think, what was surprising about was the scale, scope, and complexity of the homelessness crisis that we're dealing with. We know that homelessness is severe and getting worse. Around 80,000 people known homelessness in 2024. I think that should be a shocking number to people. To put it in perspective, that's the size of the population within a mid-sized city like the city of Peterborough, for example. It's spread out across the province, but that gives you an idea of the scale and scope. And also, I'm sure Jesse will talk a little bit more about the findings on this, about the level of chronicity that's increasing in the province. And also we learned a lot about where homelessness, it's increasing everywhere, but rural and southern communities are getting steep increases. And for a lot of our rural communities, they've been saying for years, homelessness is not just an urban phenomenon. So I think that was an important thing. And maybe I'll let Jesse about this, but talk about this a little bit more. But there's some great socio-demographic data collected as well too, to sort of figure out what the disproportionate impact was on certain populations. And sort of maybe just the last thing I'll conclude on the projections that I'm sure Jesse will talk about, how they arrived at that, are certainly shocking, showing that if we just continue as we're going, homelessness is going to continue to increase, even if there's an upturn. But in a downturn scenario, an economic downturn scenario, homelessness could more than triple to almost 300,000 people. So I think that's a clearing call and a wake-up call for people. But Jesse?
Yeah, I think, myself included, the concept of chronic homelessness brings about some stereotypical visions of what that person's experiencing. Maybe older male has been homeless for a long time, is experiencing unsheltered homelessness, perhaps higher acuity, complex needs. Hate those terms. Those are the ones we have. And so I think what was interesting, hardly interesting, concerning, was the number of youth and children. So 25% of youth and children experiencing chronic homelessness. We did hear from some larger municipalities that's a function and part of family homelessness and people sitting in the crisis response without appropriate affordable units, 2, 3, 4 bedroom. So there's that. We also saw an increase beyond the rate of growth of refugees in asylums. We saw an increase in refugees and asylum seekers experiencing chronic homelessness, which is concerning and not what the crisis response was designed for. Of course, there's a whole settlement sector, and so that indicates a kind of a multi-system failure, something happening there. Indigenous homelessness was overrepresented, and we were really clear in the report. I hope that I think actually that's a huge underrepresentation, an additional underrepresentation, and there's many more people, Indigenous people, experiencing chronic homelessness. So I think for me, those were some of the surprising findings of the WHO, and it really just indicates to me there's too many people coming in and not enough places, the right spaces for people to exit.
Yeah, in the report, I think it's referred to as the unequal effect of the crisis, right? So it's not, similar across. Even if you look at youth versus seniors, there was a article in the Star the other day talking about the poverty rate of seniors climbing. I see we seem to be getting more calls around that, and we're talking like seniors into their 70s, 80s, starting to experience, because of unaffordability, the death of a partner, anything like that, homelessness, right? It's crazy. Now, when we look at the 80,000, right, people are like, it sounds like a lot. Like, is that like what were we talking about before? What did that prior to 2024? Did we have a different kind of feel? Like, how much have we grown over the last little bit?
Yeah, you'd think I'd remember by now. What is it, 22% increase? Don't quote me on that. 22% increase since 2022. And we did that reference from 2022 because that was we felt really, really strong data that we received. And so even in the last few years, we're seeing an increase, significant increase, essentially.
Yeah. Well, to Michael, to your point, like if we just do what we're doing now, we could be looking at, close to 300,000 people, larger than the number that's been used across the country, experiencing homelessness, right? And we talked about on the show too, beyond housing, we're in a total affordability crisis around, Neil Hetherington, a frequent guest on the podcast from Daily Bread, talks about, 1 in 10 people now in the GTA using food banks because there's no housing bank. So they're topped out on housing, their income, they barely cover it. And then, so that means more and more people are right on the brink of becoming another stat of the 300,000, right? If nothing is done moving forward. And so let's talk about that. why you mentioned 300,000 experiencing homelessness by 2035, I believe the report. Can you help us understand how this could happen? And more importantly, what does we talk about significant action? What does that even look like? What are some things that need to be done so we're reducing that 80,000, not growing to 300,000?
Maybe I'll start out with that. Jesse, I'm sure, can talk a little bit about the factors that went into that projection to sort of let you know what would come into play if that worst case scenario were to happen. But glad you mentioned the food bank usage. First of all, we sort of view that as a proxy indicator for people that are in precarious housing at risk of homelessness, and that's certainly alarming. What we hear about that across the province, but we really need to. We think we really need to get ahead of the curve, on this, if that trajectory does come true. And one of the prime drivers for doing this report as well too was sort of raise the issue that more leadership and investment is needed from the provincial governments and the federal governments, because municipalities and district social service administration boards are really at their capacity. One of the things that HelpSeeker was able to collect and document and analyze was the increasing expenditures by municipalities on homelessness. Almost $500 million in 2024, and much more on housing. Municipal spending is around $2.1 billion, and we just don't have the capacity to put in that investment. So that's why we're looking to the provincial government to sit down with us and come up with an investment plan, and we can maybe talk a little later about what those solutions were, unless you want us to get into that right now.
Well, again, let's talk about the solutions, and that's what I guess we're talking about recommendations. Like, what are you saying should be done? And you're right. Like, I look at the regions we work in, and others are saying we're tapped out. Now, I think maybe due to your report and due to some of those findings, we've seen recently the federal government has given some money for encampment solutions. The province a little less, but it's done a little bit. More has to be done. What are your recommendations coming out of this report?
Maybe we did do a couple of different scenarios. Maybe Jesse would be able to speak to that in a little bit more detail. But I think there's some also interesting findings that came from HelpSeeker, not just on more investments needed, but where those investments should go to. How we need to shift the current system. So Jesse, maybe talk about the scenarios a little bit.
Yeah, and I'll start first. I appreciate you mentioning the municipal spending. It's tricky because when people are seeing increasing homelessness in their community, there's associated issues, feel like their children aren't safe in parks, whether that's perceived or not. It doesn't really matter. And then at the end of the day, they don't care whose level of government's responsibility it is, right? No one wants to hear a civics lesson on how we divided the powers of governments. But at the end of the day, if we're not able to address some of these macroeconomic issues or these systemic issues, these failures in child welfare, health, income assistance, the municipal tax base won't cover the increasing issue. And so when we modeled the scenarios, we did a couple different things. We deliberately, and this is a choice, and this is not to say that no crisis response is needed in Ontario, because in a lot of communities there are, but we didn't model any additional crisis response. We said, what would it look like to just model prevention and supportive housing for medium to high complexity transitional housing and affordable housing. So rent ups prevention, because we really focused on housing-based supports. But what we also did is we mapped not a utopia, but an ideal. And so we said, this doesn't work unless there's a baseline of, and I hate to use this word, but performance, positive exits, because it would be irresponsible for us to model a poorly performing system. So everyone kind of has to work within the system. And then frankly, there needs to be investments in health. There needs to be investments in justice. So those high complex needs, supportive housing beds, run by the Ministry of Health, we need way more of that. We need drug treatment. We need mental health supports. We need family supports. And so two answers is, one, we focus on the right spaces and the right supports, way more on prevention, which I certainly didn't come up with that. Everyone's been saying that for 20 years. And then these other systems need to function well and with increased investment too, because we can't solve it all within the purview of a sector designed to catch just those that kind of, and excuse me, but fall through the cracks. And we're trying to do everything in homelessness and housing, and can only do so much. Damn, you guys do a lot, but we can only do so much.
Yeah, well said. I mean, it's interesting to see sometimes you talk about the dollars. As of late, I keep thinking about transitional housing and where that idea came from. And it's I actually think a lot of the people we serve, transitional housing, if it's a year or two, is not really so we're putting people into very nice spaces, which is awesome, dignified, beautiful housing, where they're paying about 30% of their income, which is amazing. Um, but at the end of that year, 2 years, or whatever it is, we're trying to move them out and not having a lot of success because there's a lack of options coming out of that, right? So I think, if you ask a client, what's the best kind, they wouldn't say, yes, transitional, that's all I need, give me a couple. And, it's really the long term. And is transitional really a function of the system saying, well, listen, it's really expensive long term, like whatever, to keep you there forever. And then we have to build more and more and more because you're not going to leave, that kind of thing. And I remember years ago asking someone at a youth shelter, and they had transitional. And one of the workers, who could be dead honest with me, like, where did they transition to? He said, back to the shelter. So it's just like a circle. They spend a year there, go to shelter, they go back to like it wasn't really the function of here's how you go, right? So, I think we have to challenge some of our norms. And you mentioned prevention too. Prevention, definitely. People are waking up to the fact of can't really end it if you don't prevent new people from coming in, right? And we've seen some great models around that. But it's a tough pitch sometimes to government because prevention takes time, right? So we're going to do this now when they're grade 8. And that means we're not going to have a whole bunch of new people coming in. But that could be 10 years away, 6 years away, greater than, say, a 4 or 5 year government mandate, right? And it'll be all right. So got that. What do you have for me now? What's going to work tomorrow? So it's tougher, but hopefully we start seeing some of this long-term gain around that. What has the response been to the report so far? What have you found?
Well, we released a report earlier in January. We've gotten a lot of pickup and a lot of interest in the report from media, different stakeholders, that sort of thing across the community. It was a busy January, so the government has the report in hand. The government and various ministries that would be involved in a homelessness response, because one of the things that we think we need is a whole of government approach to address the root causes of homelessness through prevention and housing solutions. So we haven't gotten a comprehensive response yet. Really, what we want to do, we're into an election campaign now, so we are continuing to promote the report and promote positions and policies that would address the root causes of homelessness. We're doing a public awareness campaign during the election. Homelessness is one of our planks. And really what we'd like to do is sit down with the incoming government to talk about the report and formulate a plan, including an investment plan that jointly we can do with municipalities and government.
I think it's also fair to say there's been interest from other provinces. There are people looking at it and thinking, okay, how do we do that here? And of course, Ontario is in some ways set up by virtue of the service managers in a way that's advantageous, not easy, but advantageous to do this work. And I think that's encouraging. I think we're so fixed on getting the perfect number and the right number, and any kind of data aggregation requires, not to undermine the work, but requires imperfect data. And so, I hope it kind of proliferates through other areas of the country too. And yeah.
And I would say this, this report is really meant to be a platform for conversation. That's what we really wanted to spark.
And it definitely, if that's what you wanted, that is happening. Definitely. I mean, people are talking about it all over the place, right? And I think it's sometimes it was that a little bit of a fire, right? People saying this is because again, people are like, yeah, how much of a problem is it? Or it's just happening to a few, or it happens to other people. And when you look at the data in this report, you're like, wow, not the case, and happening to more and more and more. And people in the sector were like, yeah, not surprised, but that's not who we're talking to now. What are we're having a conversation. If we're talking 3 years, 4 years from now, 5 years, what are your hopes for the future around the work that's being done and homelessness in general?
Yeah, maybe I can start. I mean, again, for us, it's about having that conversation with the government. I think we need a whole of government approach, multi-ministry action plan. It would be good to continue research of this type. So now that we have a number, to be able to put interventions into play and be able to evaluate them and measure progress over the years toward the goal. I think in the scenarios in the report that were outlined, primarily what we set was a goal to end chronic homelessness by 2035. The figure of interventions that was formulated was in the order of magnitude of $11 billion. So we'd like to see that investment and progress toward that goal.
To Michael's point, I think the continued, and not necessarily even the way we did it, because it wasn't perfect, but the continued collection of data at scale, but then using it for precision planning. And so Starbucks isn't opening coffee shops on corners where no one buys coffee. And so we need to be putting supports where people need them. And I think particularly when we look at those rural and northern numbers, people need to often, if it's safe, need to stay in their home community with their natural supports. And as you know, Michael, even in York Region, there's so much migration, and particularly when youth are moving away from natural supports, if it's not a safety issue. So anyways, I think looking at the province as a whole on what do we need where is essential. And then I would be remiss to not mention Indigenous-led supports and funding into Indigenous communities, First Nation communities, in the same kind of vein of natural supports, and for those who want to stay in their community, allowing and facilitating that.
Very, very cool. Well, again, congratulations. It's a great report. It's so useful. I know the sector is grateful for it. And you both work for incredible organizations. Jesse, I got to tell you about a little story about Alina at HelpSeeker. She came on this podcast a few years ago, and I asked her for her journey into it. And she had the longest answer ever on, and she knew it. It was 22 minutes straight she talked, and it was fascinating. And because if you know Alina, the way she talks, she's she's just fun. And she went for 22 minutes. And I'm like, I'm not going to stop her. I'm going to see where this goes. And then around 22-minute mark, she said, "Oh my God, I think I've been talking too long." But it was great. Like, it was such a great story, and her story is great. But HelpSeeker itself, her and Travis and then you're part of this. You're doing incredible work across the country. Tell us a little bit about HelpSeeker, what you do, and where people can find out more.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I appreciate that. And just a plug, forever grateful to both the Turners, and they're an inspiration every day for sure. So HelpSeeker, we work largely with municipal governments, but also provincial governments and larger nonprofits, all on social data. So there's nothing else we do but data-led decision making, products that collect data, and then analysis around often housing and homelessness, but community well-being, some of the gang and gun prevention. Oh, fire alarm. That's my cue. Yes, anyways, so all data-led projects, and you can find us at HelpSeeker. You can Google HelpSeeker. I don't even know what our actual URL is. I'm terrible, but appreciate that. Thanks, Michael.
And everywhere you find socials, HelpSeeker is there, of course, and they're doing incredible work and continue to grow. Michael, Ammo, tell us where people want to find out more. If they want to see this report, they want to dig into the report, the full report, and find out other things that you're doing, because this is just a piece. It's one report. Where can they go?
Yeah, they can go to the AMO webpage, and that URL is amo.on.ca. And there's a whole range of information on a lot of different municipal topics, but right on the homepage, people can find a link to the report, our news release. We have a 2-page summary document, which is a shorter read. As well, I mentioned earlier the public awareness campaign that we're doing to try to inform the public and hopefully to inform party platforms during the election. You can find a link to our Vote Like Your Quality of Life Depends on It campaign on the website as well too. And one of the 3 planks in that campaign is to address the root causes of homelessness.
Yes, yeah, thank you for that. And thanks for all the work you both do. And listeners, listen, often you get asked, what can I do? How can I be a part of this? Or coming up, you got some big choices, both provincially And federally, let's make housing and homelessness this election, hold people accountable. And that's what you could do. That's where it starts, right? Having a voice and having people and being heard, right? Getting those, making sure that those issues are in the forefront, for sure. Jesse, Michael, thank you so much for the work you do, all you do, providing us in the sector with amazing data like you have with this report. It's so appreciated. Thanks for taking the time out of your busy day to join us on the show.
You're listening to On the Way Home with your host, Michael Braithwaite.